Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook from Broudie, Canter solicitors, and I am responsible for the day-to-day management of our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of our client, COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Lorelei King, who is a member of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, having lost her husband to COVID. On our panel today, we are pleased to welcome back Elkan Abrahamson from Broudie, Canter solicitors, who helped the bereaved family since early 2020 in campaigning for the inquiry. Also rejoining us is Nathan Oswin, who is the lead on the COVID inquiry for the Trade Union Congress. Finally, joining us for the first time is Professor Leslie Thomas-Casey, who is lead barrister representing the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations and had the opportunity to question Boris Johnson yesterday. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, it's good to see you all. I want to give a special hello to Elkan, who hosted the Module 1 podcast. It's really nice to see you again.
Nice
and
to
the
be
rest
back.
of you, of course. I'm so grateful, as always, that you guys have given your time to make this podcast for our members who find it so useful. And speaking of our members, the first thing I wanted to touch on, we had one witness this week, Boris Johnson, and it was quite a week. The press coverage was insane. There were so many people there. And there were I'd never seen the response as much from the people in the viewing room. For those who don't know, seats in the viewing room are limited. There are only about 40 of them. We had to apply online. There's you can also then queue up to go into the viewing room, which has another 40 or 50 seats. This time on the day that Boris Johnson started to make his comment, as soon as he started to apologize, and it had been leaked that he was going to do an apology, 4 members of our group, they're volunteers at the UK COVID Memorial Wall, stood up at the back with silently holding signs that said, "The dead can't hear your apologies." They were asked to sit down. They didn't. And Lady Hallett had the ushers remove them. And they've now been banned from the inquiry for the rest of Module 2. I will not ask the 3 lawyers present to offer any opinion on this, but Nathan, what did you make of it?
The challenge of not being a lawyer for the first time. I think any action like that is perfectly understandable. And in fairness to Hallett, she obviously has to protect the sanctity of the court as well. And so the reaction from her is understandable. It's a particularly emotionally charged moment. I think it's, reasonable to say that members listening to this podcast, that those that make up CBFJ have been waiting for this moment for years, for him to be held to account and grilled and put forward and make their voice heard. And actually standing up with a banner is a perfectly legitimate way to do that. Knowing the people who did the action, I suspect they knew they'd probably get removed. I think they knew what the consequences were, and it was a price they were prepared to pay. And ultimately, that's what direct action and making your voice heard is about. It doesn't hurt anyone. It's a perfectly legitimate form of protest. And look, it was an important point that needed to be made. And probably the wider question I'll lie with it is, had it come about because some members of the group haven't felt that sort of level of direct challenge would have been coming? Because actually that's the key point. If the inquiry is leaving people the impression of they are going to directly and robustly challenge, you may be saying sorry, but what are you saying sorry for? Is this just, something that you've tried? You used the word leak. It was trailed. It was very clear where it's come from. It was very much fluff pieces to try and set a narrative in advance. And people having a reaction to that is just perfectly understandable.
Thank you, Nathan. And I think just open it out a little, and we don't have to stay on this too long, but as a bereaved person who shows up there early, to make a protest. I've noticed in recent weeks that we have been more and more physically marginalized. Our concern is always having been marginalized in this inquiry. Our lawyers are given very little time to speak, as the same with FEMHO, same with TUC. And physically, we're now being marginalized. They've made a pen for us that is really set back from that. So, as I've said before, our loved ones needed protecting from them, and yet everything that they do at the inquiry seems to protect the witnesses from us, who've never done anything. We've always been dignified protesters. Even Lady Hallett has said that from her seat.
A few things to point out. First of all, as you say, the bereaved have been marginalised, have not been allowed for the most part to tell their stories in the inquiry. And you look at the way the Scottish inquiry is being conducted, and they are hearing day in, day out from the bereaved. So it could be done. It could have been done. The other point is that the demonstration inside the inquiry room was respectful, was silent, was people standing at the back with banners. In other inquiries, that's been allowed, in fact. And the third point is, I think the chair had the choice of simply saying, I'm going to rise for 10 minutes to give everyone a chance to calm down a bit. I'll come back and hopefully we can carry on. She chose not to do that. She chose to have a confrontation straight away. And by doing that, she chose, knowingly or unknowingly, to allow the bereaved actions to dominate the headlines the next day. So there are implications to what she did, which she may or may not have appreciated at the time. Personally, I think she did the wrong thing. I think she should have risen for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Elkan. Leslie, do you think, I had the impression she opened her speech with a quite stern lecture that I think was directed at the witness. Do you think I'm right? We're about trailing, as Nathan calls it, about these leaps of what Johnson was going to do.
It did come across in that way, didn't it? I mean, so I don't know what was in Lady Hallett's mind. What I would say is that if it was any other court participant who leaked or trailed Boris Johnson's statement, it makes you query for what purpose. The headlines and the articles that were written in the various media and newspapers are all pretty favourable in relation to Boris Johnson and what he wants to put out. So it just makes it would be a fairly odd thing for other court participants to do. So if I can put it in that way, the question is, who did it favour? And there was only one real recipient who benefited from that leak, and that was Boris Johnson. Whether it was, somebody close to him on his team, I don't know. But I think your observation is not an unfounded observation in relation to Lady Hallett and where her remarks may have been directed. But yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder if it put her in a little bit of a bad mood for the demonstrators. The response in the room, I've never seen so much response, people reacting. In fact, Lady Hallett a few times had to chastise the room about their vocal. In fact, two or three women at one point shouted out things. They were just chastised. They weren't removed. Can I ask you guys, there's one question I've seen a lot in the chat boards and that the bereaved families are very concerned about, and that is Boris Johnson's phone and these missing WhatsApp messages from January to June 2020. Nobody believes that they can just vanish. Nothing vanishes these days. What can you, Nicola, what can you tell us about that?
So the context of this is the witness claims that he handed everything over that was of any possible relevance. However, there was an issue with his WhatsApp messages between January 2020 and June 2020. They have apparently all been lost. Obviously, those 6 months were the most crucial 6 months in terms of when our country became aware of the virus, what we should have been doing to prepare and how we responded. So he claims all of those have been lost from his phone. Now, some of the other players in this have their part of the conversation. So we have had access to some of his messages from their devices. But the interesting thing for me is throughout the 2 days, there's been a real atmosphere in the room that isn't there ordinarily. But it's the difference in the atmosphere from moment to moment. It goes from real high tension, upset, distress. But when he was giving his explanation about his phone, there was actual laughter in the room because his explanation was considered to be so ridiculous that it just wasn't capable of being believed. And he must have heard that laughter. There's no way he couldn't have. I don't know whether people watching at home will have been able to hear it, but I've seen so many comments on Twitter about how WhatsApps can be recovered and it's quite technically easy. And it's flabbergasting that he has been able to get away with this as an explanation.
Do you think, I mean, you may not be able to answer this, but I know, do you think we will ever be able to see these exchanges in evidence?
It certainly doesn't seem like it. His legal team have obtained this technical report in which they say it's not possible. I don't think the inquiry has really looked into it as much as they could have done. But as I say, there are some of these conversations that we've been able to get from the other participants in the WhatsApp exchanges. So not everything has been lost. And I think the crucial thing about this is if this inquiry was reliant upon the statements that have been gathered by the inquiry, we would have got nowhere near as close to the truth as we have done by getting access to the WhatsApps and the Patrick Vallance diary. Those, for me, are the crucial bits which show just how chaotic our government was operating at the time.
Nicola, you've mentioned that. I wonder if this would be a good time to talk about what I found one of the most chilling moments during this week's testimony, which was when Hugo Keith started to read out. This is what I will call let it rip gate. They've had a good innings, 82, get COVID, live to 82, all those horrible, horrible messages. And he just kept bringing up document after document. And he was speaking very quietly. And I don't remember how he did it, but Boris Johnson had tried to interject and had been suppressed somehow. And it was absolutely chilling. What did you make of that, Elkan, that moment?
Yeah, I agree. It was an important moment, partly because there was a delay in calling up some of the comments, which meant there was a sort of 20-second period of silence where Johnson was just sitting there and no doubt was bursting to say something, but controlled himself, probably to his detriment, maybe. But it made for a very effective moment, I think. His end excuse to using all these terms seems to be, I was playing the ordinary citizen in the room and trying to put forward a plain speaking position which would allow other people to. It certainly to me it doesn't ring true. And I was going to ask Leslie in that context as an advocate. We're very restricted in the questions we're allowed to put, both time-wise and even word-wise. And you decide as an advocate in front of particular tribunals how far you need to push a point. When a judge, for instance, a judge has got it and you can move on. And with the jury, you might have to push it a bit further because it's not clear to you if they've understood it. And with this chair, how restricting is the time limits on questions? Do you feel that you're able to explore a point enough so that she gets it? I find it very difficult to assess any feedback from her on whether she's getting the points or not.
Okay, so you raise an interesting question, but can I just come before I come and answer your question, Elkan? about how restrictive this is. I think the whole diary that was being put to Boris was really interesting, because did everybody notice he didn't deny the word attributed to him? And when there was that period of times when they were calling up the various messages, his words really landed, and they really landed because I have no doubt that he said them. If he didn't say them, that was his opportunity to say, I didn't say them, and he didn't. So we can assume. But all of those diaries and the things attributed to him in quotes is what he said. So I thought Hugo Keith did that just right. I think that that was a really important moment in the inquiry. Now, coming to your point, Elkan, about how restricted we are as applicants, I've done so many of the inquiries, public inquiries and inquiries. And the thing I would say is this: the answer to the question is in the title. It's a public inquiry. So it's not just for the benefit of the judge who's chairing the inquiry. It's really important that the public, because this is the public's benefit, understand the evidence and the points that's being made. So there are times when it's obvious that the judge understands the point. And of course, Lady Hallett's going to understand the point because she had the documents in advance, she's seen the witness statements in advance. It's not so much for her benefit, it's for the public. So the question is what she's doing effective to allow the public to understand? And I suppose what I would say, representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations, is it's mixed. I have mixed in. Some of the time that I've been provided with has been short, but I suppose it being short has enabled me to be more focused in my approach. It really you have to make every minute count, and sometimes there have been times when we've been granted 5 minutes. I think that's the shortest amount of time that we were granted. Yesterday, I was granted 13 minutes of Boris. But I can see how it's different if you're representing the bereaved as opposed to professional clients. When you're representing, if you're an advocate for the bereaved, it's really important to be given the time and space to get your points across and not feel that you're being rushed. And that's a difficult balance for the chair, because on the one hand, we understand how there has to be some grip on the inquiry so it doesn't run out of control. I get that, and I sympathise with that position. But on the other hand, it's really important that the call participants feel that proper respect is being given to them so that they can make their points. And I think there have been times when an extra day, how much of a problem would that be to grant the bereaved families and the other non-state call participants an extra day to get some questions in, or an extra half day? I think that's all it would need. And we're all sensible, we're all grown up advocates. Everybody, nearly every advocate on the inquiry has got a lot of experience. Nobody's abusing their position and taking advantage. So I do think a little bit more leeway could be given to enable families and those representing the dead an opportunity to have their say. So that's what I would say on that.
Nathan, I see you reacting to that. The TUC had a shockingly short time yesterday, didn't they?
So we had 10 minutes argued up from 8, which is what we originally got. Although, Baroness Hallett did give us a bit of a leeway, so we ended up with sort of 11 minutes. And it's really interesting, as we talk there. And I think, from a client's perspective of us as the TUC, very much echo of that sort of, we walk in knowing and understanding and believing that those representing the bereaved and those sort of lived direct, really highly impacted groups need the most time, actually, to be able to really challenge, because it just morally feels right as much as anything else. I think that it is challenging, but there is an exercise that, will happen behind the scenes that sort of the public won't see, that, as Leslie describes, you know what questions you've been allowed to go, and you sort of have to go through an immediate triaging process of actually what's the thing that's really, really most important to you, because the chances of you being able to ask all your questions within that real small limit of time is quite difficult. So it really makes you stress test your, why are we in the inquiry? What is the purposes of us being here? What is the outcome that we think needs to happen? What are the important questions for, our members and affiliated unions? And so there's, in some ways, it's quite a good exercise, because you don't wander off into other areas that, frankly, other people are better at asking the questions. And I think that's been the interesting bit across Module 2. You've started to see who the chair or CTI, or whoever is ultimately the real influencer in terms of determining the Rule 10s, who they think are the right people to talk about the right things. And so that's why, we seem to be, someone wants to ask a question on self-isolation support or financial support for poor people. Welcome the TUC. Please come along and ask your questions. But, we've probably put in similar other questions, to FEMO, who will have, obviously equality strands are majorly important to us. But FEMO's the right organisation to ask it, because of who that audience and the expertise and where everything sits. And you see it again similarly with the BMA, who have got very similar concerns to us about health and safety and airborne transmission in the workplace. But their level of expertise is the one that has been recognised as sort of their niche area. It's interesting. It does feel frustrating at times. And I think, particularly when, as I've mentioned before on previous podcasts, we haven't got public funding for our legal support. And so we're taking a huge investment to play a role within the inquiry itself. And so when you get a few minutes to ask questions on behalf of over 5 million working people, it can feel somewhat frustrating at times. But I do think, again, it showed why CP questions are so important, because Johnson struggled more with them, I think, than he did the majority of day one in particular, because a lot of the witnesses come up with a line that's just a narrative flow, and all of a sudden you have experts drilling down into detail. And, like Leslie sort of getting him to admit, there was a huge report into the NHS that identified institutional racism as a problem. Were you aware of it? No, mate, never even heard of it. That in itself is a shocking state of affairs for a former Prime Minister to have to admit. That would never happen through the normal line of questioning. And I do hope that Hannah goes away and thinks maybe CPs need a bit more space and a bit more time ahead of future modules, because court participants are proving their worth time and time again with the political witnesses.
It's a good point, Nathan. RKC, Pete Weatherby, had 20 minutes, didn't he, Nicola?
Yes, we were given 20 minutes, which we managed to stretch out to, I think, 30. So that was good that we weren't cut off. But I think Pete's questioning was really the first time where we saw Boris Johnson get really rattled. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. And I think really this was the first time where he couldn't spin it, because at the very start of his evidence on day one, Hugo had put to him where the UK was in the tables in terms of how bad our response was. And Boris just completely dismissed it and said, I don't agree, I don't accept it, but wasn't able to say why. And so Pete really had to drill him quite hard on this. And all he was saying was, I don't accept your evidence because I've seen something else, but couldn't provide that evidence as backup for the point he was making. What is really striking is just how fit Boris Johnson is. Obviously, I'm saying that sarcastically, but the mental gymnastics this man is capable of performing is quite outstanding. It's something really to watch, because unless you have all the facts at your fingertips, which Pete did, it's very easy to see how someone like Boris Johnson is able to get away with saying things without the facts to back himself up. And so Pete was able to take him from one report to another to a graph, and made the comment, "We know you struggle with graphs," because that had been put that had been put in evidence by other witnesses. Even then, Boris wasn't able to say why he disagreed with the evidence. He just simply didn't accept it because it didn't suit his narrative of how our country performed. But Pete did amazingly well, and I was very pleased to be sitting next to him, and I hope that our clients were pleased with what Pete did.
I think what I saw in the chat rooms, everyone was pleased, especially in the face of what appeared to me to be incredible rudeness from the witness toward RKC. I do know what you mean. It's like he seems to think if he says something, this is true, I think, of that whole government. If you say it often enough, it becomes true. It's so maddening, almost like alternative statistics. I don't know. It was very frustrating. Do you agree, Elkan?
Yeah, I agree. I was just going to say there was one point where I think Pete missed a trick when Johnson was being asked about having said "F you, Daily Mail," and said, "Oh, that was inappropriate. They're a marvellous institution." And Pete's follow-on question should have been, "Whom you now work for, of course," which, we missed out on that.
That was a moment, and it was just very interesting that his first instinct was to protect his relationship with this newspaper instead of addressing what they were actually talking about.
I think that was the one time where he looked like it was a genuine apology. That actually, I'm really, really sorry to the Daily Mail, whereas everything else felt far, far more rehearsed. The apology that we were talking about at the start was just very, very rehearsed. You can tell he's been sat there for weeks thinking, how do I frame this? How do I say it? What's the tone I'm going for? Being caught on the hop about his employer and going, it's a fine institution. You think, well, you've spent more time trying to defend what you've said about them because you're worried about upsetting them than you have on any other bits. And it was the first time, I think, as well, that when something was put to him, he'd said behind the scenes, the answer wasn't, I'm sorry that things that were never meant for the public discourse have hurt people because they've put in the public domain. He never actually, on any of the other points, said, I'm sorry for saying it. I shouldn't have said it. There was always a justification. The second it became about the Daily Mail, it wasn't, I'm sorry the Mail found out. It was, I'm sorry I said it because it's a fine institution. And if that doesn't show a sense of prioritization and a failure to understand why things are offensive and that some things are not said, and again, I know we've covered this bit. The Valence Diaries don't say Johnson again played devil's advocate and said, they always just say Johnson arguing, and if you're playing devil's advocate, which I love to do, as Nicola and Elkan will definitely know, so if you say at the start, I know I'm being a devil's advocate here, but, that's never been the case. And it was one of the more insightful moments into his character compared to his normal bluster, bluffing and waffle that best sums up a large amount of his contribution for the 2 days.
Co-sign. I found it interesting that in his opening statements, and when Hugo Keith first started asking him questions on day one, he said I'm responsible, everything. Yes, 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 I was responsible. And he seemed to be taking on this responsibility. And yet, throughout the rest of his testimony, we heard the word collectively a lot. And I was told, so kind of negating that. And I especially noticed this when they started to talk about Eat Out to Help Out. I'm sure next week's witness is going to have, I hope, is going to be questioned quite a lot about this. But I just wonder if I could ask you what you thought about his reactions when it was suggested that he shouldn't have approved Eat Out to Help Out. Elkan, what did you think?
I think Hugo Keith went easy on him from memory. I'm just trying to recall. I think Hugo said something like, there is no unequivocal evidence that it led to an increase in deaths. Is that right? And I don't know whether that's right or wrong. I haven't read all the data. It would be surprising if it hadn't led to an increase in deaths. But once Hugo made that concession, it then became, I suppose, a slightly less important topic for Johnson. Because if he could say at the end, well, no harm done, it was an easier topic for him to put to one side and assess as not that serious, I guess.
It wasn't no harm done. You mean no provable harm done? I think that's the thing, because it was clear that cases rose. And I agree with you. That's, that was unfortunate. And I think the what appeared to me to be lies, I can say that. He kept saying it was not presented to me as a risk. And Hugo Keith did bring up again, but it wasn't presented to you at all. From all the testimony we've heard from the scientists last week, especially, I think it was last week, they said we were not consulted.
I don't think he needed it to be presented to him as a risk. I think it was common sense, really, wasn't it? He doesn't need a scientist to say that to him. He surely would have thought, well, putting a lot of people in a confined space is going to increase the transmission, isn't it? He could then have gone on to say, let's hear what the scientists have to say. But even without that, he didn't need that input from the beginning.
There is also reports that are public domain that do prove it drove infection. So there's a Warwick University study that showed it drove infection rates by between 8 and 17%. Now, and you know, the simple causation with this stuff is not always necessarily proving that it increased deaths, because it's about increasing transmission. If you increase the transmission rate, you increase deaths by its very definition of it being a deadly virus. And there's numerous studies out there that show it did. And you're right, you know, Keith could have pushed back. And it is just blindingly obvious. That's the bit that it was a disappointing. I wonder whether the question is whether the inquiry has sort of gone, we've got enough evidence on this. You know, the important point here is the suggestion of, were scientists consulted? Because you're saying in your statement that scientists were consulted. And now all of a sudden you're going, well, I presumed they were consulted. You know, and so that's why they focused on it. And whether they've sort of established as a baseline their belief as to whether it did drive infection or not. And this is the bit, isn't it, as well, that for people who are not as closely linked to the inquiry, that they don't often realise that it's an iceberg. And the bit that we're seeing is 2% at the top. And 98% of it is the paperwork behind the scenes that is done far and away from the gaze of the cameras. And actually, you know, have they come to a position? That's the thing that it left me thinking was, are they at a point with some of this where they've started to form an opinion, or at least think our opinion is better formed on the paperwork and the evidence behind the scenes, rather than just giving people like Johnson a platform to sort of express their, I was going to say views, but excuses for why things happened.
Yeah, and as I was saying, I hope that with Monday's witness, the current Prime Minister, who is then Chancellor of the Exchequer, I hope we're going to hear a lot more on this topic.
Just on Johnson's excuse that no one presented it to him as a risk, this is where I think Hugo Keith really missed an opportunity. So Johnson says Eat Out to Help Out, i.e. eating in a pub or restaurant, having a meal, wasn't presented as a risk to him in the summer of 2020. That flies in the face of what he was told in March about banning mass gatherings, when he was told there's no point in banning mass gatherings because if we do that, all that will happen is everyone will go to the pub. So it's not safe to go to the pub in March, but it's perfectly safe to encourage everyone to go to the pub in the summer. He'd already had that advice. He didn't need to have it again. But by the by, he's saying no one presented it to him as a risk. No one was given the opportunity because no scientist's advice was sought on it. The evidence he gave was, well, I find it hard to believe that Patrick and Chris Whitty didn't know about it because it was so public. Yes, it was public after it was announced. The point is, they weren't asked for their advice beforehand. Professor John Edmonds said, Eat Out to Help Out was encouraging people to take an epidemiological health risk. Patrick Vallance said in his evidence, it inevitably drove up transmission. And if it drove up transmission, it inevitably increased deaths. That's the evidence from Patrick Vallance, and that wasn't put to Boris Johnson. And it should have been.
Also, it puts to pay the notion that he does do devil's advocacy. Because if your whole mindset is, I'm going to say the things in the room that need to be said to challenge ideas, and to the point that you will say offensive things that are just beyond the pale, and someone comes to you with an idea and says, I'm going to stick a load of people in a room shortly together, and your devil's advocacy brain doesn't say, but what about the health risks? Then you're not very good at devil's advocacy. That's an even simpler thing. And, I think, it probably is a character end that, the only sort of logical, justifiable defense, if you believe his sort of devil's advocacy stuff, which I don't for a second, but it's saying, well, where are you getting your belief of what other people are saying? Because, if you're reading a particular type of paper that does focus on the idea of unlock, won't somebody just let us have all our freedoms back and not focus on the other ends? And you're not aware of the idea of the other argument that says life comes before money, then it probably suggests where you're getting your information from. And that in itself, if that's the chain of events, is deeply problematic because everything becomes skewed by ideological positioning on an issue or a prioritization of value sets, rather than trying to do what good governance should be, which is to take incredibly difficult decisions. No one's pretending these decisions are easy by any stretch, but to weigh the two sides against each other to try and find the best path that does the least damage and the least resistance. And again, I don't think, and another trick it felt like Hugh missed was, I can't remember a point over the 2 days where there was a real pushback on, but surely you have to understand that the more people infected and the more people dying leads to a bigger hurt on the economy. And so actually the epidemiological factor is the best way to protect the economics and the jobs of people, because that's what drives long-term growth. And I don't remember a time that was put, and Eat Out to Help Out is the best example of when you can be talking about that, a false understanding of economic principles that is driven by short term rather than medium term.
Maybe back to the point you made about devil's advocacy, Nathan, that makes me remember the discussions about that infamous meeting on the 20th of September when Johnson invited these Great Barrington Declaration scientists. And I know someone's going to correct me if I've got this wrong, but it seemed to me that the inquiry was then suggesting that meeting was called in order to back up the then prime minister in what he wanted to do, rather than any true sense of getting a balanced view, that he wanted evidence that what he wanted to do, which was open up, suggested that he could do that. Am I wrong about that, Nicola?
I think the evidence around that meeting is so clear when you listen to the vast majority of the scientists who were present. And then the evidence from Boris Johnson is, I'm such a great leader, I want to hear from all the voices in the room to make sure that Joe Public is present and that their concerns are being addressed. And yet he says he didn't read any of the SAGE papers apart from maybe one or two. he didn't consult the scientists on Eat Out to Help Out and ignored the scientists when the advice was to have a circuit breaker. And so it very much seems that he is in the business of opinion shopping to validate what he wants to do. And I think, was that meeting productive for him? I don't think so.
He also, and this annoyed me. I was in the room at that point where he suggested that I think he actually said that the Barrington, I'll call them Great Barrington scientists as a shorthand, came round eventually to believing in NPIs, and the inquiry, of course, pressed him on that, and he became very stumbly and started saying things like, "Well, it's abstract," and this is kind of the Boris Johnson that I've come to know. After Hugo Keith finished, of course, we know that the other core participants get a very limited amount of time to respond. And Leslie, you brought up immediately why no measures for a vulnerable minority were brought in by the government at the time during the pandemic, and you kept trying to bring him back to this point. How did you find interviewing him? How did you find him as a witness?
Boris is an interesting witness. I don't think it's right to underestimate Boris, but I think he knows what he's doing. He's, very smart, and he knows how to dodge questions. And we've seen him do that many times at the dispatch box. He's got years of experience in dodging questions when he was former Prime Minister. So I had that in mind, and so the approach that I took with him, knowing that was going to be his likely response, and having seen how he was answering questions to counsel the inquiry, and Hugo Keith Casey, I thought a polite but firm approach was what was needed, and to bring him back to the questions that were being asked. We haven't seen too much of that, I'm afraid, during the inquiry. And I thought just a slightly different approach, slightly firmer but polite tone, and then, confronting with issues. Look, he's the sort of witness who, if he knows that something is not in his interest, he's not going to agree, even if all the evidence points in a certain way. That's the sort of witness I assumed him to be, and I think I was proven right.
There was a moment I was at the hearing. I had a seat in the hearing room, but at some moments, and this is true for a lot of bereaved to attend, it's a little bit too much to be in the room, so we retreat to the viewing room. And I happened to be in the viewing room when you were interviewing the witness. And I think there was at some point he was accused of possibly trying to be running down the clock because the time you were given was very limited. And I just wanted you to know this. You said, "You wouldn't try to do that, Mr. Johnson." The viewing room burst into applause. And it was an amusing moment. And I think even Lady Hallett, the camera cut to her, and she had a big smile on her face. So I think even she was amused by that.
Well, that's an advocacy device where you suspect that that's what the witness might be trying to do. So what you do is you call it out, but you call it out in a way that, that you say, you wouldn't, that's not what you would do. You're too good for that. And so it lets the witness know that you know what they're potentially up to, and it hopefully will discourage them from, making those sorts of comments.
Well, it gave us, after it was a really rough 2 days, because this was for the end of the second day, it gave us a little bit of light relief. So I have to thank you for that. Can I now thank you all again for participating, but can I come to you now for either your standout moments or your final thoughts about this week's testimony? Nicola, can we start with you?
It's been a momentous 2 days. So it's it's difficult to pick out just a few standout moments. I've managed to narrow it down to a top 5. Firstly, Johnson apologised, but when asked what he was apologising for, couldn't name a single thing. Secondly, he was asked what mistakes he accepts he made, and the only thing he could come up with was that they relied on messaging, and sometimes Scotland said something slightly different, and they need to sort that out for future. Thirdly, he refused to accept the statistics about where the UK was in the league table as compared with other countries. But if they were right, then it was our fault for having an ageing population with comorbidities. So it was our fault for getting old and ill. And if South Korea did do better than us, it was because they were better prepared, because they'd had other SARS and MERS, which we'd had, but they'd learned from it, but we hadn't. So we did get some sort of a concession there. Fourthly, Leslie, on behalf of FEMO, put to him that it was his clients who saved his life, and in return, he did nothing to protect them by making sure they had properly fitting PPE, for example. And finally, when being asked questions by Brenda Campbell KC on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved, Boris admitted that he hadn't watched the evidence of the bereaved at the start of Module 2. So Brenda put to him the evidence of Katrina Miles, who lost her father around Christmas. And essentially, as she was being told on the 18th of December, she had to say goodbye to her father. On that very same day, there was a party in number 10 Downing Street where people had cheese and wine and played Secret Santa. He had the decency to at least look shamefaced, but still there was just no real understanding by him of just how damaging that was.
Those are really important points, Nicola, and thank you for bringing them up. It was such a week with so much incident. It's hard to remember, and I'm remembering everything you say. And thank you for bringing up the fact that he didn't hear the testimony of the bereaved, and thank you for bringing up Partygate. That's a huge subject that is touched on again and again, but thank you for reminding us. Elkan, what was your standout moments?
The moment, apart from the ones that Nick has mentioned, the moment that stays with me today is when he was talking about falling ill. One of the two moments when he became very emotional. The other one was about the second lockdown, I think. And he was saying, and in effect, what he was saying, but didn't quite say it, was, until that moment, I didn't think I was the kind of person who would be affected by COVID. It really had no relevance for me, except in the abstract. And then I go to hospital, and he said, and I saw people like me, meaning, I think he was saying middle-aged, well, he did say middle-aged people. He didn't say white people, but I wonder if that was the subtext. And he suddenly thought, oh, yes, this is actually relevant. You know, it's not just an abstract game I'm playing here. People like me might actually get it, and people like me might actually die. I don't think his attitude when he got out was any different, strangely, but that did seem to be a genuine moment in his evidence.
Yes, you mentioned his emotion. I think the time he became emotional around there was when he said we locked down, but then it came back, and he appeared to get emotional. But that was in the middle, I believe, of his testimony about Eat Out to Help Out, which I found quite extraordinary. I think I've remembered that correctly. Professor, if we could have your thoughts, your standout moments.
I think the standout moment for me was when Boris tried to, despite all the evidence, tried to still deny what he knew about the whole Partygate scandal. That was just, for me, I just found that unbelievable. Unbelievable. That he could sit there and still maintain that things were being done appropriately. as you can tell, I'm lost for words because it just beggars belief. That was the standout moment to me.
I agree. And there are so many of the bereaved who will agree with you. And finally, Nathan, what about you?
Yeah, so we very directly challenged him on his approach to working with important partners and stakeholders and such off the back of his WhatsApps, I think, from memory they were, rather than an email. They also, it was a Valence diary, where it highlighted in the period of 2021 coming back to work, him saying, we can't have the consulting with employees and trade unions. They all need to get back to work. All those work-shy, malingering people, just the great British public that he's talking about in a lovely term, as we've grown accustomed to. And he just couldn't bring himself to fully deny, again, saying it. He never suggested that he didn't say it. Interestingly, he didn't say it was a devil's advocate position this time. He just sort of ignored the fact that those words were down there. Oh, no, I was just very, very keen to get people back to work and for us to open up. Again, not an unreasonable sense of wanting to achieve something, but it was the method of doing it. And I think the bit that summed up, I think, quite a lot, really, of how Johnson is and that sort of obfuscating. I think, as Leslie earlier on really accurately pointing out, this is not a guy who will ever agree with you if he doesn't want to say it, or it's self-damaging, even if there's 30 million bits of evidence. But Sam just said to him, is it as simple as it is what it is on the page? And that's sort of the story of the last two days, I think, has been just things in black and white that have very clearly been said, very obviously impacting, very obviously speaking to his character and worldview, and then not taking any action about it and somehow trying to obfuscate and deny. And again, he just doesn't come across as a credible witness. And I think the other thing, by the end of it, and we were the penultimate set of questions, he looked knackered and he looked tired. And I had someone message me that I think really sums up where he is, when they said he just looks like a shell of his former self. And this once large personality, bombastic, that had, unsurprisingly, you will find that I'm not a huge admirer of his policy setting or worldview, but he was a gifted communicator who resonated with people and was an electoral machine. There's just a reality about that's who he was. And he doesn't look anything like it anymore. And I think yesterday was the final example that he's finished. He will never come back politically. He'll never lead a major party again. He'll never be in a position of leadership in something as important as a statesman role or to lead a major institution. And that's part of the legacy of this now, that actually that's there. And as you know, Lorelei, when I come on, I tend to do a big thing and at some point about the importance of campaigning and people coming together. But again, that's part of this. This situation's enforced. The things that they did were exposed because working people who had suffered a loss came together to challenge a system that was not benefiting them. And it's just that in a couple of days of real frustration and annoyance and the sense that he was allowed to just obfuscate and dither is an important bit not to lose sight of at a time that it is so emotionally charged. And, I found the last 2 days draining. I can only imagine what you and your members have felt, because it'll be a million times more so. But it's draining. But that bit of just seeing him into the sunset away, whether he deserves a sunset or not is an entirely separate point. But the fact that it just looks like he will never, ever, ever be able to come back into a position to influence and hurt people's lives again in the way that he did during the pandemic through his sheer incompetence and failings, is a milestone in itself.
Thank you all so, so much. Elkan, it's so lovely to see you again. I've missed you. And Nathan, thank you for coming on. You always give such incredible commentary. And Professor, thank you so much. Nicola, as always, so grateful so grateful that you're making this podcast for the bereaved.
Thank you, everyone. And we will be back next week with our final podcast, touching on the evidence of Rishi Sunak and the closing submissions of all the CPs.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.